If what he just said was true, then someone had been lying to me for 20 years. That thought followed me all the way home that night, but it started only a few minutes earlier, beneath the crystal chandeliers of a country club ballroom packed with smiling faces. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 72 years old, a widow, a mother, and until that evening, I believed I knew my family. The celebration was supposed to be simple. My son Ryan and his wife Jessica were renewing their vows on their 20th wedding anniversary. Everyone called them the perfect couple, perfect parents, perfect neighbors, perfect community leaders, the kind of family people pointed to when they wanted an example of how life should turn out. I sat at a round table near the dance floor, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy blue jacket while guests mingled around me. Soft music drifted through the room. Servers carried trays of sparkling cider and appetizers. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling. Ryan stood near the stage laughing with business associates. Jessica moved through the crowd like she owned the room. She greeted everyone by name. She hugged people. She accepted compliments with practiced grace. Watching her, I felt proud. Maybe that sounds foolish now, but it's the truth. For 20 years, I had defended her whenever anyone criticized her. I told people she had a good heart. I told them she loved family. I told them I was lucky to have a daughter-in-law like her. Then an older gentleman approached my table carrying a cup of coffee. I recognized him vaguely. One of Ryan's former co-workers, I thought. He smiled warmly. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "it's good to finally meet you." I smiled back. "Finally?" I asked. "Oh yes," he said casually. "After all these years, I've heard so much about you. I always wondered why you never came to the family events." I laughed softly. "I'm not sure what you mean." His expression shifted. "The charity galas, the lake trips, the holiday gatherings. Ryan always said you preferred staying home." I stared at him. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. "Ryan said that." "Of course," he replied. "Everyone thought you valued your privacy. Jessica always seemed disappointed that you declined the invitations." The room suddenly felt warmer. The music sounded farther away. I forced a smile and changed the subject, but something inside me had begun to move. A tiny crack, a single loose thread. During dinner, I found myself watching my family differently. Ryan raised a toast and spoke about loyalty, honesty, and family values. Guests applauded. Jessica wiped away a theatrical tear. The audience adored them. I looked around the ballroom and realized something unsettling. Nearly everyone here believed they knew my story. And perhaps they did. The problem was that it wasn't my story at all. It was the version someone else had written for me. On the drive home, the highway stretched dark and quiet ahead of me. Streetlights flashed across the windshield every few seconds. I kept replaying that conversation. The lake trips, the holiday gatherings, the charity events. Memories surfaced one after another. Invitations that never arrived. Family photos I saw only after they were posted online. Vacations I learned about weeks later. Birthdays celebrated without me. At the time, I had accepted every excuse. Scheduling mistakes, miscommunication, last-minute changes. Life gets busy, I told myself. Families drift apart sometimes. But for the first time, another possibility entered my mind. What if none of it had been accidental? When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car without turning off the engine. The porch light cast a pale glow across the front yard. My house was quiet, empty, still. I thought about the smiling faces in that ballroom. I thought about 20 years of explanations, 20 years of excuses, 20 years of believing the best about people I loved. Then I reached for my purse and pulled out my phone. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in explanations. I wanted answers. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock above the kitchen stove. For years, I had enjoyed that silence. It felt peaceful, familiar. That morning, it felt different. It felt like a room full of unanswered questions. I made coffee and carried my mug to the dining table. The same oak table where my husband and I had shared thousands of breakfasts sat in front of me. I looked at the empty chair across from mine and found myself wishing he were there. Not because he would have solved the mystery, because he always noticed things I missed. He used to tell me that people revealed themselves in patterns, not moments. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I wondered if he had been talking about life. I opened my laptop and searched through old photographs. At first, I did not know what I was looking for. I simply followed a feeling. One picture led to another. Christmas gatherings, Graduation parties, summer vacations, family reunions. The farther back I looked, the more details began to emerge. There were photographs of Ryan and Jessica standing beside relatives at a lake house I had never seen. There were pictures from holiday dinners I did not remember being invited to. There were smiling group photos taken at events I had learned about only after they happened. For years, I had accepted every explanation. Jessica always had one ready. Sometimes she said plans came together at the last minute. Sometimes she claimed invitations had been lost. Other times, she blamed technology. A missed email, a phone number entered incorrectly, a calendar mix-up. Each excuse sounded reasonable by itself. Looking back at 20 years of memories, they no longer felt reasonable. They felt organized. I opened an old folder containing emails I'd saved over the years. Most people probably delete messages without thinking. I never did. My husband used to joke that I treated emails like family heirlooms. That habit suddenly became useful. I spent hours reading, slowly, carefully, looking for dates, comparing conversations, cross-checking events. Around noon, I found something that made me stop. It was an email chain from 12 years earlier regarding Emma's 10th birthday party. I remembered that birthday clearly. Jessica had called me and said Emma wanted a small celebration with friends from school. She told me there would not be room for extended family. I had felt disappointed, but I understood. At least, I thought I had. Attached to the email chain was a guest list. My name was on it. Not only was my name on it, but someone had manually removed it later. I stared at the screen. Then I checked another message. And another. In several cases, invitations existed. Plans existed. My inclusion existed. Yet somehow, I had never received the final information. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For a long time, I did not feel angry. I felt something worse. Embarrassed. Embarrassed by how completely I had trusted the people closest to me. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the backyard. The world looked exactly the same as it had the day before. But inside that house, something had shifted forever. Because for the first time, I was no longer asking whether I had been excluded. I was beginning to discover how it had been done. For the next several days, I settled into a routine that would have looked ordinary to anyone passing by. I watered the flowers on my porch. I went to the grocery store. I folded laundry. I answered phone calls from neighbors. But every quiet moment belonged to something else. The investigation had become impossible to ignore. Each answer uncovered 2 new questions. Every memory I revisited seemed to contain details I had overlooked at the time. One afternoon, I opened a box of old family albums that had been sitting in my hallway closet for years. Most of the photographs had been printed before everyone carried cameras in their pockets. I turned the pages slowly. There was Emma as a toddler holding a stuffed rabbit, Ryan grilling hamburgers in the backyard, Jessica smiling beside a decorated Christmas tree. At first glance, everything looked normal, happy. But then I started noticing dates. Certain years were filled with pictures. Others had strange gaps. Events I remembered hearing about had no photographs sent to me. Vacations appeared out of nowhere. Gatherings seemed larger than I had been told. I found myself reaching for a notebook and writing things down. Dates, locations, names. It felt ridiculous, like something from a detective novel. Yet the list kept growing. By the end of the afternoon, an uncomfortable pattern had emerged. The missing invitations were not random. They clustered around certain occasions. Milestone birthdays, family trips, school celebrations, community events. The very moments when families usually come together. I stared at the notebook for a long time. Then I remembered something else. About 8 years earlier, Emma had won an academic award at school. I had sent flowers because Jessica told me tickets were limited and only parents could attend the ceremony. I still remembered feeling disappointed. I searched through an old email archive and eventually found the message. Attached to it was a digital flyer from the school. The flyer clearly stated that grandparents were welcome. I read the line 3 times. Then a 4th. The room suddenly felt smaller. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were not. For years, I had blamed circumstances, busy schedules, misunderstandings, modern life. I had never seriously considered deliberate exclusion because I did not want to believe the people I loved could choose it. Later that evening, my phone rang. It was Emma. We spoke occasionally, though not as often as I wished. Her voice sounded cheerful. She asked about the anniversary celebration. I told her it was beautiful. Then there was a pause. A small one. The kind that appears when someone is deciding whether to say something. "Grandma," she said, "I was surprised you came." I frowned. Why would that surprise you? Another pause. "Mom always said you did not like family events." I felt my heartbeat slow instead of quicken. Strange how the biggest shocks sometimes arrive quietly. "She told you that?" I asked. "Since I was little," Emma replied. "She always said crowds made you uncomfortable." I looked out the kitchen window into the dark backyard. 20 years. 20 years of stories. 20 years of explanations. 20 years of assumptions built on words I had never spoken. Emma continued talking, unaware that my entire understanding of the past was shifting beneath my feet. When the call ended, I remained standing by the window. The reflection staring back at me looked older then. It had a week earlier. Not weaker, just wiser. Because for the first time, I realized the truth had never been hidden from only me. It had been carefully rewritten for everyone around me. The conversation with Emma stayed with me long after we hung up. I could still hear the uncertainty in her voice when she told me what she had been taught to believe. She had not sounded cruel. She had sounded sincere. That was what troubled me most. A lie repeated often enough does not feel like a lie anymore. It begins to feel like history. The next morning, I pulled my notebook closer and started a new page. At the top, I wrote a simple question. Who benefited from my absence? I stared at those words while sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor. For years, I had focused on the hurt, the missed birthdays, the forgotten invitations, the empty holidays. Now I wanted to understand the purpose behind it all. As I reviewed old records, another pattern emerged. Whenever I had been excluded from an event, Jessica somehow became the center of attention. In photographs, she stood beside organizers, donors, teachers, church leaders, and community volunteers. She was always introducing herself as the person who kept the family together, the person who cared for everyone, the person who created memories. I found an article from a local newspaper featuring a charity fundraiser from 6 years earlier. I remembered hearing about that event after it happened. Jessica had told me attendance was limited. Yet there she was in the photograph, smiling beneath a headline praising her commitment to family values and community service. Something else caught my eye. The article mentioned that the fundraiser had been inspired by stories about caring for aging relatives. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. I had never attended the event. I had never spoken to the reporter. Yet somehow my existence had become part of the story being told. That afternoon, I drove to a small coffee shop downtown. An old friend of Ryan's worked nearby. His name was Kevin. I had known him since he was a teenager. We exchanged greetings and spent a few minutes talking about ordinary things. The weather, retirement, the rising cost of groceries. Then I casually mentioned the anniversary celebration. Kevin smiled. "Jessica has always been good at building relationships," he said. "People love hearing her stories about helping your family." I felt my chest tighten. "What kind of stories?" I asked. Kevin shrugged. "The usual. How much she sacrifices. How she organizes everything. How she keeps everyone connected." Connected. The word lingered in my mind all the way home. Connected. I thought about the birthdays I missed, the graduations, the vacations, the holidays. I thought about Emma believing I disliked family gatherings. I thought about strangers assuming I chose isolation. By evening, I understood something I had missed before. This was not simply about excluding me. Exclusion was only the method. The real goal was control of the narrative. If I stayed invisible, nobody could compare Jessica's version of events to reality. Nobody would ask questions. Nobody would hear another perspective. For 20 years, my silence had become part of the performance. I sat alone in my living room as darkness settled outside the windows. The notebook rested open on my lap. Every page contained dates, names, and discoveries, small pieces of a much larger picture. I was no longer searching for proof that something was wrong. That question had already been answered. What I needed now was something far more important. I needed evidence strong enough that no one could dismiss it when the time finally came. Over the following week, I stopped looking at the past through the eyes of a hurt mother and started looking at it through the eyes of a witness. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. Hurt searches for comfort. A witness searches for facts. Every morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, a cup of coffee, and another piece of the puzzle. The more I uncovered, the more I understood that the image people saw in public had been built very carefully over many years. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a woman named Linda. We had served together on a charity committee nearly 15 years earlier. We had not spoken in a long time. After a few minutes of polite conversation, she mentioned the anniversary celebration. "Jessica has always been remarkable," she said. "The way she took care of you after your husband passed away was inspiring." I nearly dropped the phone. "What do you mean?" I asked. Linda sounded surprised by the question. She talked about it often. She always said she was helping you with appointments, errands, paperwork, everything. I thanked her for the conversation and ended the call a few minutes later. Then I sat perfectly still. During the years after my husband died, I had handled nearly everything alone. I paid my own bills. I drove myself to appointments. I maintained my house. Ryan occasionally helped with repairs, but Jessica had rarely been involved. Yet somehow, a completely different version of reality had spread through their social circle. That evening, I opened social media for the first time in months. I began scrolling through old posts, birthday tributes, holiday messages, family photographs, community events. At first, they appeared harmless. Then I started reading the captions more carefully. Again and again, Jessica positioned herself as the person holding everyone together. The devoted wife, the caring mother, the compassionate daughter-in-law. What caught my attention was not what she included. It was what she omitted. Entire events had been rewritten. Situations where I was absent because I had never been informed were presented as though I had chosen not to attend. In one post, she thanked family members for supporting Emma during a school achievement ceremony. I remembered that day. I remembered sitting alone at home, believing visitors were not allowed. Hundreds of people had liked the post. Dozens had commented. Nobody questioned the story because nobody knew another version existed. Slowly, a realization settled over me. Jessica had not simply controlled communication within the family. She had controlled perception outside the family as well. The two worked together like gears in the same machine. One kept me isolated. The other protected her reputation. A few days later, I met Emma for lunch at a small diner near her college campus. The place smelled like coffee and fresh pie. We talked about classes, work, and ordinary life. Then she said something that stayed with me. "Grandma, growing up, I always thought you preferred being alone." Her voice carried no accusation, only confusion. "Why?" I asked gently. Emma looked down at her glass. "Because every time there was a family event and you were not there, Mom would say you liked your independence more than gatherings." I nodded slowly. There it was again. The same narrative, the same explanation, the same carefully planted belief. When lunch ended, I hugged Emma goodbye and watched her walk across the parking lot. For the first time, I realized the damage extended far beyond missed invitations. An entire generation had been taught who I was without ever asking me. And if I wanted the truth to matter, I would need more than memories. I would need proof that could speak louder than 20 years of storytelling. After my lunch with Emma, I stopped searching for confirmation and started building a record. The distinction mattered. Confirmation satisfies curiosity. A record survives denial. Every document I found now went into a carefully organized folder. Emails were sorted by year. Event invitations were grouped by occasion. Social media posts were saved with screenshots and dates. I even created a timeline across my dining room table, arranging 2 decades of family history in a way I had never seen before. What surprised me was not the number of incidents. It was the consistency. The same explanations appeared over and over again. The same misunderstandings. The same convenient mistakes. One afternoon, while reviewing messages from years earlier, I discovered an exchange that made me sit back in my chair. It involved a Thanksgiving gathering from nearly a decade before. I remembered that holiday clearly because I had spent it alone. Ryan had called me the day before and explained that several relatives were sick, so the celebration had been canceled. At the time, I accepted his explanation without question. Yet buried inside an old email folder was a message sent by a cousin 2 days after Thanksgiving. Attached were photographs from a large family dinner. Nearly everyone had attended. The date matched perfectly. The event had not been canceled. It had happened exactly as planned. I looked through the photographs slowly. There was Ryan carving turkey. There was Jessica smiling beside a decorated table. There was Emma, still a teenager then, laughing with cousins. I was nowhere in sight. More importantly, there was no empty chair waiting for me. No sign that anyone expected me to be there at all. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall. Years ago, That discovery would have broken my heart. Now it strengthened my resolve. Emotional pain fades. Evidence remains. A few days later, another unexpected piece fell into place. While cleaning out a cabinet, I found several old holiday cards. Most people would have thrown them away. I never did. Inside one envelope was a handwritten note from a distant relative. The note thanked me for hosting a wonderful family gathering. I frowned immediately because I had never hosted such an event. After reading further, the truth became clear. Jessica had organized the gathering at a rented venue, but had apparently told guests that the idea came from me. Once again, my name had been used while my presence had been removed. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Publicly, I was portrayed as a beloved family elder whose wisdom inspired everyone. Privately, I was excluded from many of the very moments where that image was displayed. The contradiction felt almost surreal. That evening, Ryan called. His voice sounded cheerful. He asked about my garden. He mentioned a local sports game. He talked about the weather. Not once did he ask how I was really doing. Not once did he mention the questions that had been growing inside me. I listened politely. I answered calmly. When the call ended, I placed the phone on the table and looked at the folders surrounding me. For the first time, I understood that this situation was larger than one misleading story or one missed invitation. It was an entire system built over 20 years. And systems do not collapse because someone gets angry. They collapse when someone finally shines enough light on them that everyone else can see what has been there all along. 2 weeks later, an opportunity appeared that I could never have planned myself. Ryan and Jessica announced a major charity gala benefiting several local community programs. The event would be held at one of the largest venues in the county. Business leaders, elected officials, reporters, church members, and longtime family friends were expected to attend. Social media was filled with announcements. Photographs appeared almost daily. Jessica stood at the center of every image, smiling beside banners and sponsors. Ryan spoke about service, generosity, and family. The comments were exactly what I expected. People praised them. People admired them. People called them an inspiration. This time, however, I looked at those posts differently. I was no longer seeing a celebration. I was seeing a stage. A few days after the announcement, I received an invitation in the mail. The envelope was thick and elegant. Gold lettering. Formal language. My name printed carefully across the front. I almost laughed when I opened it. For 20 years, invitations had somehow disappeared. Now one arrived without difficulty. I placed it on the table beside my growing collection of documents. The contrast felt almost symbolic. That evening, I reviewed everything I had gathered. Email records, screenshots, event flyers, guest lists, messages, notes from conversations. None of it depended on opinions. None of it relied on memory alone. Every piece connected to something verifiable. Together, they told a story very different from the one most people believed. As the gala approached, I noticed something else. Jessica became unusually attentive. She called twice in 1 week. She asked about my health. She offered to arrange transportation to the event. She even suggested that I sit at a table near the front. Years earlier, those gestures would have warmed my heart. Now they raise questions. Why now? Why after years of distance? Why after the anniversary celebration where a stranger had accidentally exposed the first crack in the narrative? I did not confront her. I simply listened. Sometimes silence reveals more than argument ever could. A few days before the gala, Emma stopped by my house. We sat on the back porch while the late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the yard. She seemed thoughtful, more thoughtful than usual. Eventually, she asked whether something was wrong between me and her parents. I considered my answer carefully. I'm learning some things about the past, I said. Emma nodded slowly. I have been learning things too. Neither of us said much after that. We did not need to. There was an understanding growing between us. Not built on accusations, built on questions, honest questions. As she prepared to leave, Emma paused beside her car. Grandma, she said softly, I hope whatever the truth is, people finally listen. I watched her drive away and felt something I had not felt in weeks. Hope. Not hope that everyone would suddenly agree with me. Not hope that old wounds would disappear. Hope that truth, once visible, has a way of creating its own momentum. The morning of the gala arrived clear and bright. I woke early. I chose a simple dark blue dress and a pearl necklace my husband had given me years ago. Then I looked at the folders stacked neatly on my dining room table. For a long moment, I stood there in silence. 20 years of stories had built a very powerful image. That evening, hundreds of people would gather to celebrate it. What none of them knew was that I would be walking into that ballroom, carrying something far stronger than anger. I would be carrying the facts. The ballroom looked exactly the way people imagine success should look. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across perfectly arranged tables. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Waitstaff moved through the crowd carrying trays of appetizers and sparkling drinks. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling. Community leaders shook hands. Business owners exchanged greetings. Local reporters moved between conversations gathering quotes. At the center of it all stood Ryan and Jessica, welcoming guests beneath a large banner celebrating service, generosity, and community. When I entered the room, Jessica spotted me almost immediately. Her smile widened. She crossed the floor and embraced me in front of several guests. "I am so happy you came," she said warmly. People nearby smiled at the scene. It was exactly the image she wanted them to see. I returned the hug politely. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied. Then I took my seat near the front of the room and waited. The evening unfolded exactly as expected. Awards were presented. Donations were announced. Speakers praised volunteer efforts. Several people publicly thanked Ryan and Jessica for their leadership. The applause seemed endless. At one point, a short video montage played on large screens positioned around the ballroom. Photographs flashed across the room. Family moments, community events, holiday gatherings, school celebrations. Looking around, I noticed something almost amusing. I appeared in several images, sometimes standing beside Ryan, sometimes sitting beside Emma, sometimes smiling at family dinners. To the audience, the message was clear. A close family, a loving family, a united family. What the audience could not see were the dozens of moments that had happened without me. Near the end of the program, the master of ceremonies approached the microphone. He thanked sponsors, volunteers, and donors. Then he smiled toward my table. "Before we conclude tonight," he said, "we would like to recognize someone very special. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, a beloved mother, grandmother, and inspiration to this wonderful family. Mrs. Brooks, would you honor us with a few words?" The room erupted into applause. Hundreds of faces turned toward me. For a brief moment, Jessica appeared pleased. Ryan smiled confidently. Neither looked concerned. Why would they? For 20 years, I had remained silent. I walked slowly toward the stage. My pearl necklace caught the light as I crossed the ballroom. The applause faded. The microphone waited. I looked out across the audience. Friends, neighbors, community leaders, people who believed they knew my story. Then I began. I thanked everyone for attending. I congratulated the organizers. I spoke calmly, softly. The room relaxed. Then I shared the conversation that had started everything at the anniversary celebration weeks earlier. I described discovering invitations that had never reached me. I described learning that family events I supposedly declined had actually taken place without my knowledge. The room grew quieter with every sentence. No one interrupted. No one laughed. No one moved. I explained that rather than react emotionally, I had spent weeks reviewing records. Then I nodded toward a folder I had carried with me. Inside were copies of emails, guest lists, event notices, photographs, and messages collected across 2 decades. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just documents, facts, dates, evidence. A large screen behind me displayed several examples that had been prepared in advance. The audience watched silently as timelines appeared. Invitations sent and altered. Events explained one way publicly and another way privately. Statements compared against records. I never raised my voice. I never accused anyone of being evil. I simply showed people what I had discovered. By the time the final document appeared on the screen, the ballroom had become so quiet that I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. And for the first time in 20 years, the story everyone believed was no longer the only story in the room. For several seconds after the final document disappeared from the screen, nobody spoke. The silence felt different from any silence I had experienced before. It was not the silence of being ignored. It was the silence that follows a truth people are still trying to absorb. I stood calmly beside the podium and looked across the room. Some guests stared at the documents they had been handed. Others exchanged uncertain glances. A few looked toward Ryan and Jessica. For the first time all evening, They were not the center of a carefully managed story. They were simply two people facing questions they could not easily dismiss. I thanked the audience for listening and stepped away from the microphone. There was no dramatic exit, no argument, no scene. I returned to my seat and folded my hands in my lap. Around me, conversations began quietly. Then they grew. People compared notes. People revisited memories. People connected details they had never questioned before. Several guests approached my table. Some apologized for assumptions they now realized were based on incomplete information. Others thanked me for presenting everything with dignity. What struck me most was that nobody seemed interested in gossip. They were interested in understanding. The facts had done exactly what facts are supposed to do. They encouraged people to think for themselves. Later that evening, Emma found me near the entrance. Her eyes were red from emotion, but her voice remained steady. She wrapped her arms around me and held the hug longer than usual. "I did not know," she whispered. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. Emma had been a child when most of those stories were created. She had inherited a version of reality that others built around her. We stood together for a moment before she stepped back and smiled through her tears. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from her in weeks. In the days that followed, the impact spread farther than I expected. Community members who had admired the public image began asking thoughtful questions. Family friends reached out privately. Some shared experiences that suddenly made more sense in light of what had been revealed. Others admitted they had always sensed inconsistencies, but never had enough information to understand them. Meanwhile, something surprising happened inside me. I had expected relief. I had expected anger. Instead, I felt peace. Not because 20 years could be erased. They could not. Not because every relationship would magically heal. Some would not. The peace came from no longer carrying the burden of silence. For 2 decades, I had accepted explanations that diminished my place in my own family. I had doubted my instincts. I had blamed circumstances. Now I no longer needed to wonder. The truth was visible. And once truth becomes visible, it no longer depends on one person defending it. A week later, Emma visited again. We spent the afternoon looking through old photographs together. Real photographs. Real memories. No rewritten captions. No missing context. Just family history as it actually happened. As the sun began to set, she asked whether I regretted speaking up. I looked out the window for a moment before answering. "No," I said, "because this was never about ruining anyone. It was about refusing to disappear." Emma nodded quietly. The room fell silent again. But this time, it was a peaceful silence. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to hide. And as evening settled around the house, I realized something important. They had spent 20 years shaping an image. I spent a few weeks uncovering the truth. In the end, the truth needed far less effort to stand on its own.